Parrot warns neighbors about danger. Its words were a chilling reality. Polly, an African gray parrot, lived in a small, cozy home tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood. This neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and picket fences, had always been the epitome of peace. The houses were modest but well-kept, and everyone knew each other's name. The kind of place where neighbors would wave from their porches, exchanging pleasantries, and children played freely in the front yards. It was the type of place where you could walk down the street at any time of day and still feel a sense of safety and security. Polly's home, however, was anything but ordinary, for she was not just a pet, but an integral part of the household, filling it with laughter and warmth. If you love animals and want to watch more amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe to help the author. Let's begin. Her owner, Mrs. Thompson, was an elderly woman who had lived alone for many years. With her children scattered across the country and her husband long gone, Mrs. Thompson found solace in the company of Polly. Polly, though small and seemingly simple in appearance, had a remarkable talent. She could mimic almost any sound she heard, from the ringing of the phone to the rustling of leaves in the wind. But what Polly was best known for was her ability to imitate human speech. Over the years, Mrs. Thompson had taught Polly a number of phrases, simple and kind words that filled the house with a soft, almost musical tone. "Hello," Polly would chirp every morning when Mrs. Thompson opened the door. "Good night," she would say as Mrs. Thompson settled into her armchair to read a book in the evening. Though Polly was incredibly intelligent, Mrs. Thompson never expected the parrot to be anything more than a companion, a source of gentle amusement. Polly's favorite perch was an old, worn-out stand near the living room window, from which she could look out and observe the world. Every morning, she would watch the sun rise over the neighborhood, her feathers ruffled from the night's rest. Her days followed a simple, unchanging pattern. Mrs. Thompson would wake, make her breakfast, and then sit down to a cup of tea while Polly entertained her with small phrases. The world outside seemed far away, and inside, life was a calm, predictable routine. Polly's life, however, wasn't just about providing entertainment for Mrs. Thompson. There was something deeply comforting in the rhythm of their shared existence. The mornings were filled with the clinking of teacups, the low murmur of the television in the background, and the occasional squawk from Polly. Even when Mrs. Thompson had moments of sadness or loneliness, Polly's presence was a constant source of joy. The two of them, separated from the bustling world outside, found peace in each other's company. Mrs. Thompson had long since lost the feeling of loneliness that often haunted people of her age, for Polly filled the void with her antics, her mimicking, and the surprising moments when she said something unintentionally hilarious. For the Ramos family, their neighbors next door, Polly was also a comforting presence. Mr. and Mrs. Ramos were a middle-aged couple who had lived in the same house for over 20 years. Their children were grown, with families of their own, and they found themselves in a stage of life where everything seemed to slow down. Their mornings were often spent sipping coffee on the porch, watching the neighborhood come to life. The sound of Polly's voice, drifting through the walls, was a reminder of the quiet, comforting predictability of life. Mrs. Ramos, in particular, enjoyed hearing Polly mimic the same phrases every day. It was as if the bird had become a part of their daily routine, an odd but endearing neighbor. Each morning, as the sun's rays pierced through the thin curtains, Mrs. Ramos would hear Polly's familiar squawk. "Hello," Polly would say, sounding almost human in her greeting. It was an odd little ritual that brought a sense of warmth to the Ramos household. It was a small thing, but it made the mornings brighter. As the days passed, the Ramos family became accustomed to Polly's presence, even if they never spoke directly to her. Every now and then, Mrs. Ramos would wave across the fence at Mrs. Thompson, and they would share a few words, laughing about the parrot's antics. "Polly's been particularly chatty today," Mrs. Ramos would joke. The streets outside were equally calm. The neighborhood was safe, and people often lingered on their porches, chatting with one another about their day-to-day lives. Cars passed slowly, children rode their bikes, and the occasional dog barked in the distance. There was a sense of community in this little corner of the world, a sense that no matter what happened, everything would stay the same. Mrs. Thompson, too, lived comfortably in this peaceful existence. She often spent her afternoons sitting on the porch with a book in her lap, or visiting the local grocery store with Polly perched on her shoulder. The simplicity of her life was both fulfilling and quiet, and she had grown accustomed to this calm, unwavering routine. For Mrs. Thompson, the slow, steady rhythm of the days seemed to offer all the comfort she needed. There were no pressing concerns, no demands that couldn't be met. The most significant decisions she faced each day were what kind of tea to brew or which book to read. Her life was stable, rooted in a sense of familiarity and peace. She had lived through the ups and downs of life, weathering both personal triumphs and losses, but at this point, she was content to live quietly, without the chaos of the world intruding. As the seasons changed, so did the nature of Polly's companionship. Winter brought longer nights and colder mornings, and Mrs. Thompson found comfort in the warmth of her house, with Polly nestled close. The bird would stay near the fire, contentedly preening her feathers, while Mrs. Thompson spent hours curled up in her favorite chair. It was the sort of routine that didn't demand much, but it was a routine that had grown deeply comforting over the years. Mrs. Thompson had no intention of seeking anything else. She had found her place in this quiet little world. Yet, life has a way of reminding us that no comfort lasts forever. The tranquility of Mrs. Thompson's life was about to be shattered, though she couldn't have known it at the time. Polly, the bird who had been so steadfast in her daily routines, was about to become an unexpected hero. It would be Polly, of all creatures, who would alert the neighbors to danger, a danger that no one could have predicted. But for now, the morning continued as it always had. The sun rose, the birds outside chirped, and Polly squawked her usual greeting, unaware that she was about to become a crucial part of a life-or-death moment. For now, the world was as it always had been, calm, comfortable, and predictable. For Mrs. Thompson, life had always been quiet, predictable, and serene, but even in the stillness, there were undercurrents of change, subtle shifts that, over time, would come to challenge everything she had grown accustomed to. Her days, while filled with the comfort of routine, also carried the weight of the passage of time. At 78, Mrs. Thompson was keenly aware of the changes in her body, in her energy levels, and in her own reflection in the mirror. Time was creeping up on her, and despite her best efforts to maintain her independence, she began to feel the edges of her life becoming frayed. There were days when she found herself reaching for a chair more often, or when the simple task of going up the stairs seemed to take more out of her than it once had. At first, the changes were small, an occasional pain in her knee, a slight shortness of breath after climbing the stairs. But they were enough to make Mrs. Thompson uneasy, even fearful. She had always prided herself on being independent, never relying on others for help. She had weathered many storms in her life, including the loss of her husband several years ago. Yet now, she found herself beginning to question how long she could continue living alone in her little home. It wasn't just the physical limitations that troubled her, it was the sense of isolation that seemed to creep in more and more. Her children, while loving, lived far away. Visits were infrequent, and the phone calls became shorter, often interrupted by the noise of their busy lives. They had their own families, their own responsibilities. It had been months since they had come to visit, and although they assured her they would, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but feel like she was losing touch with them. The world outside her home had changed so much, and though she still read the newspapers and watched the news, she found it increasingly difficult to relate to the fast-paced, modern world. There was a time when she had embraced the change, but now it all felt so distant and foreign. Even the neighbors, whom she had known for years, seemed to be growing apart. The Ramos family was friendly enough, and they often exchanged pleasantries over the fence. But their children had grown and moved away, and while they still lived next door, there was a quiet distance between the families. Mrs. Thompson didn't want to impose on them, so she kept to herself, rarely asking for help. But at times, especially during the winter months when the days were shorter and the nights colder, she felt a deep sense of loneliness that even Polly's comforting squawks couldn't dispel. One afternoon, as the weather grew colder and the sky began to take on the golden hue of early evening, Mrs. Thompson sat in her favorite armchair by the window. She sipped her tea slowly, the warmth of the cup soothing her chilled hands. Polly was perched on her stand, staring out the window with a look of intense focus. It was in this moment, as she gazed out at the empty street, that the first stirrings of something more than routine, began to emerge within her. As she watched the leaves of the oak tree sway gently in the breeze, a thought occurred to her, one that she hadn't fully considered before. Her life, as content as it was, felt increasingly fragile. She began to wonder what would happen if she became too ill to care for herself, or if there was an emergency she couldn't handle on her own. Her independence was something she had fiercely protected, but the truth was that the thought of losing it terrified her. It wasn't just the physical limitations that troubled her, but the growing realization that she might be more vulnerable than she had ever been before. At that moment, Mrs. Thompson thought of her children. She wished they could be there with her, but she knew that they couldn't. Her son had a busy job in the city, and her daughter was raising 3 children of her own. They both had their lives, and though they would have helped if she asked, Mrs. Thompson didn't want to be a burden. So, she made do, relying on Polly and the familiarity of her routines to get her through the days. But that thought, that nagging sense of uncertainty, didn't leave her. She needed to find a way to make her life safer, more secure. It wasn't just about physical health. It was about the quiet knowledge that her life was no longer as it once had been. As Mrs. Thompson sat there, reflecting on these thoughts, she heard a noise outside. It was a faint sound at first, like a distant rumble, but it quickly grew louder, and she recognized it as the sound of a car approaching. She turned her head to look out the window, expecting to see the familiar face of a neighbor passing by. But what caught her eye instead was a strange vehicle, a black van, unmarked and unfamiliar, driving slowly down the street. Mrs. Thompson squinted, trying to make out the details, but the van was too far down the road for her to see clearly. She turned back to her tea, but the image of the van lingered in her mind. Something about it felt off, as if the very presence of the vehicle had disturbed the otherwise peaceful rhythm of her day. But she dismissed it. It was probably nothing, just a delivery van or someone passing through. She had seen similar vans before, especially during the busy holiday season, when people came and went, delivering packages and running errands. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach. Polly, who had been quietly preening her feathers, suddenly let out a loud squawk. "Fire! Fire!" she screamed, the words cutting through the silence of the room like a knife. Mrs. Thompson jumped in surprise, nearly spilling her tea. Polly's screech was sharp and urgent, and for a moment, Mrs. Thompson wondered if she had imagined it. But no, Polly squawked again. "Fire! Fire!" it repeated, its voice growing more frantic. Mrs. Thompson froze. She had never heard Polly make such a noise before. Yes, Polly could mimic sounds and phrases, but this was different. It wasn't just random squawking, it was deliberate, as if the parrot was trying to communicate something urgent. For a brief moment, Mrs. Thompson wondered if something had triggered Polly's outburst. Was there a fire nearby? Was it just a coincidence that Polly had chosen this moment to speak those particular words? Her heart began to race as the weight of the situation sank in. Was there something wrong? The unease she had felt earlier suddenly seemed much more significant, as if Polly's words had awakened a deeper sense of fear. She stood up quickly, placing her teacup down on the table. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of urgency, a need to do something, to take action. But what should she do? The fire, if it was real, could be in the house next door. Mrs. Ramos had mentioned before that the house had a faulty heater, and the idea of a fire in the house wasn't entirely out of the question. But even so, what if Polly was just mimicking a sound from a past memory? Despite the doubts in her mind, Mrs. Thompson couldn't ignore the urgency of Polly's warning. She hurried to the window, pulling back the curtain to get a better view of the neighborhood. That was when she saw it, the faintest curl of smoke rising from the house next door. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat. It was real. There was smoke, and it was coming from Mrs. Ramos's house. In that moment, everything changed. Polly had spoken, And Mrs. Thompson was no longer in her comfortable routine. She had a choice now, a responsibility even, to act. And so, despite her fears and uncertainty, Mrs. Thompson rushed to the phone and dialed 911, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. She knew, deep down, that this was a moment she would not forget, the moment when her quiet, predictable life collided with the unpredictable, life-threatening reality of the world outside. The sound of Polly's urgent squawks had shattered the peaceful rhythm of Mrs. Thompson's morning, replacing her quiet tea time with an unsettling sense of urgency. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared out the window, watching the smoke billow from the house next door. Mrs. Ramos's house, the one she had seen so many times through her front window, was now engulfed in an eerie haze that cast an unnatural shadow over the entire block. The first flickers of panic swept over Mrs. Thompson as she realized the danger was real. It wasn't just a figment of Polly's imagination. Something was happening, and it was happening right now. Without a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Thompson grabbed her phone. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed 911, her hands trembling. She had never called for help before. She had always prided herself on managing things on her own. But now, with smoke rising in the distance and Polly's squawking growing louder in her ears, the situation was far beyond her control. The familiar rhythms of her life, the routines that had once been so comforting, were quickly becoming irrelevant. This was no longer about maintaining a semblance of normalcy. This was about survival, and the lives of others were at stake. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm, professional voice cut through Mrs. Thompson's panic, grounding her for a moment. She tried to steady her breath as she spoke. There's a fire. The house next door, Mrs. Ramos's house. It's on fire. I think they're still inside. You need to send someone quickly. The dispatcher asked her for her address and other details, but Mrs. Thompson's mind was already racing ahead. The reality of the situation settled heavily over her like a thick fog. There was a fire next door. She couldn't tell if Mrs. Ramos and her husband were inside, but she knew one thing for sure. Something had to be done. She had to act quickly, or it might be too late. As the dispatcher confirmed the emergency services were on the way, Mrs. Thompson ended the call and quickly grabbed her coat, preparing to leave the house. The air outside was cool, but her body was alight with nervous energy. She moved swiftly, gathering her thoughts as she approached the front door. But then, as if sensing her anxiety, Polly let out another shrill, repeated squawk. Fire! Fire! The words struck Mrs. Thompson with the force of a slap, and she froze for a moment, staring at the bird. There was something deeply unsettling about Polly's insistence. It wasn't just a mimicry of something Polly had heard before. It was purposeful, urgent. It was as if Polly understood something Mrs. Thompson had not yet processed. The parrot had sensed danger, had responded with a clarity that Mrs. Thompson couldn't ignore. She realized in that instant that she had to move. She couldn't wait for help to arrive. She had to act. The fire, though still distant, could spread in seconds, and the Ramos family's lives could be in jeopardy. Pulling open the door, Mrs. Thompson stepped into the cold morning air. The street was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Polly's squawking still echoing through the house behind her. She looked at the house next door again, now seeing the flames licking at the edges of the windows. Her heart skipped a beat. There was no time to lose. Mrs. Thompson had always been a creature of habit, her days marked by routine. She knew the comfort of her little home, knew the safe path to take to the mailbox, to the grocery store, to the park. She had never envisioned herself in a position like this, standing at the precipice of danger, forced to act in a moment of crisis. But now that she was here, she felt an undeniable surge of adrenaline. This wasn't her world anymore, at least not the one she had known. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do next, but instinct drove her forward. She would not sit idly by while her neighbors, her friends, could be in danger. With trembling hands, Mrs. Thompson ran toward the Ramos house, her feet crunching against the gravel of the driveway. Her mind raced. She couldn't remember if Mrs. Ramos had any medical conditions that would prevent her from escaping on her own. She had never thought to ask, as the Ramos family had always been so self-sufficient. But now, with smoke pouring from the windows and the fire growing stronger, she realized that it didn't matter. What mattered now was that she needed to get to them. She had no idea if anyone was home, but she had to find out. Her heart pounded louder as she neared the front door. She was almost there when she suddenly froze in her tracks. The sound of the fire, now crackling and roaring in the background, seemed to blur into the frantic beating of her own heart. She felt the weight of the decision she was about to make. Should she knock? Should she try to force her way in? What if the fire was already inside the house? She didn't know what she was doing, but her legs carried her forward anyway. As she approached the front door, Mrs. Thompson glanced back toward her house. She could still hear Polly's warning, echoing in her mind. Fire! Fire! Mrs. Thompson swallowed hard. This was real. There was no time for hesitation. With a shaking hand, she reached out and pounded on the Ramos family's front door. She knocked 3 times, hard and fast, and then waited, her pulse racing. The sound of the flames grew louder, more intense. Still, no one answered. Panic began to creep up her spine, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to remain calm. She knocked again, louder this time, shouting through the door. Mr. and Mrs. Ramos, are you home? There's a fire. Please answer me. Nothing. The silence between each knock was deafening. Mrs. Thompson's breath came in short bursts, her mind a chaotic whirlwind. Was it too late? Had the fire already taken over the house? Her heart dropped into her stomach, and for a moment, she thought she might faint from the overwhelming fear. But then, just as she was about to give in to despair, the door creaked open. Mrs. Ramos stood there, her face pale with shock but otherwise unharmed. She looked at Mrs. Thompson with wide, fearful eyes, as though unsure of what to say. Mrs. Thompson's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Mrs. Ramos. There's a fire. It's right there. Mrs. Thompson managed to gasp, pointing toward the house. We need to get out. You need to leave now. Without another word, Mrs. Ramos grabbed her husband, who had appeared behind her, and the two rushed out the door, both looking dazed but thankfully unharmed. Mrs. Thompson was relieved to see them safe, but she didn't allow herself to linger. There was still danger. The flames were spreading quickly. Call the fire department, Mrs. Thompson shouted as they ran down the steps. She quickly dialed the fire department again, making sure they knew the situation was urgent. Help was already on the way, but Mrs. Thompson couldn't wait. She had to make sure the neighbors were safely out of the house before the fire could do any more damage. As the fire truck sirens began to echo in the distance, Mrs. Thompson felt a sense of relief, though it was tempered by the reality of what had just transpired. Polly's warning had been more than just an alarm. It had been a call to action. Mrs. Thompson had stepped out of her comfort zone, left behind her familiar routine, and entered a world that was both chaotic and dangerous. But despite the fear and uncertainty, she had acted. She had saved her neighbors, and in doing so, had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. As the fire department arrived and took control of the situation, Mrs. Thompson stood back, watching as the professionals worked to contain the flames. She felt her body finally relax, the adrenaline beginning to wear off. It was then that she realized the full weight of the decision she had made. She had entered the unknown, and though the outcome was uncertain, she had done what was needed. She had faced fear, confusion, and doubt, and had emerged stronger for it. As the smoke continued to billow from the Ramos family's house, Mrs. Thompson found herself standing at the edge of something she hadn't prepared for: action in the midst of chaos. Despite the overwhelming panic that had initially gripped her, there was a new clarity now. The fire was real, the danger was tangible, and there was no turning back. Mrs. Thompson had never imagined herself as someone who would be called upon to act in such a situation. She had always been the quiet observer, the one who kept to her routine and stayed out of the way. But here she was, in the heart of a crisis, and the need for quick thinking and decisive action had never been more urgent. The sirens of the approaching fire trucks grew louder as they neared the neighborhood, but they weren't close enough yet. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do next. She had done what she thought was right. She had gotten Mrs. Ramos and her husband out of the house, but the fire was still raging, and there was no guarantee it wouldn't spread further. She had no training in fire safety, no knowledge of how to control a situation like this. All she had were her instincts, and in this moment, that was all she could rely on. Her gaze shifted back to the house next door. She could see the flames licking at the windows, the smoke swirling in the air. The situation was rapidly becoming more dangerous. Mrs. Thompson's chest tightened with anxiety, but she couldn't afford to let fear control her now. She had to do something, anything, to help. She turned back toward the Ramos family and quickly spoke. "We need to get further away. The fire could spread fast. Are you both okay? Do you need anything?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was shaky, but she pushed forward with a sense of urgency. Mrs. Ramos nodded, her eyes wide with shock. She looked back toward the house, her mind seemingly still processing what was happening. "We're fine," Mrs. Ramos said, but her voice was distant. Her husband, still in a daze, stood beside her, his face pale. Mrs. Thompson's heart went out to them. She knew that in moments like this, the shock could be just as dangerous as the fire itself. She needed to get them to safety to calm them down. "Come on, let's move away from here," Mrs. Thompson insisted, gently guiding them to the edge of the yard. They walked in silence, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Mrs. Ramos was clutching her husband's arm tightly, her breathing shallow, but she was following Mrs. Thompson's lead. For a brief moment, Mrs. Thompson felt a pang of guilt. She wished she could do more. She had always prided herself on knowing what to do in every situation, but this was different. The world had been turned upside down, and her instincts were the only things that could keep her grounded. Once they had reached a safe distance from the fire, Mrs. Thompson looked back toward the house. The fire trucks had arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the smoky haze. Firefighters quickly sprang into action, positioning hoses and breaking open windows to allow the smoke to escape. Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of relief wash over her as the professionals took control, but the sense of urgency had not dissipated. The fire was still burning, and there was no guarantee the situation was over. She turned back to Mrs. Ramos, who was standing beside her, watching the scene unfold. "We need to make sure we're prepared for anything else," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice steady. "You should call your family. Let them know you're safe. And if there's anyone who might be affected, we need to make sure they're accounted for." Mrs. Ramos nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She dialed a number, but her voice cracked as she spoke to her daughter on the other end. Mrs. Thompson could hear the worry in her voice, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she turned her attention back to the fire, watching as the firefighters worked to contain the flames. The noise of the fire and the activity around them were overwhelming, but Mrs. Thompson knew she had to keep her focus. There was no room for distractions. Her mind kept returning to Polly, the parrot who had sounded the alarm. Polly had been the first to recognize the danger, the first to react when no one else could. It had been Polly's squawking that had sent Mrs. Thompson into motion, that had awakened her to the reality of what was happening. It was clear now that Polly had a much deeper understanding of the situation than anyone could have imagined. As the firefighters continued to work, Mrs. Thompson's thoughts turned inward. She had always thought of herself as a passive participant in the world around her. She had never been one to seek out excitement or adventure, preferring instead the quiet rhythms of her daily life. But today, everything had changed. She had stepped outside her comfort zone, faced down a terrifying situation, and done what was necessary to protect her neighbors. In the process, she had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed. But even as she felt a sense of pride, there was a nagging feeling at the back of her mind. Had she done enough? Was everyone safe? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. It was only then that she noticed something. The fire trucks weren't the only vehicles parked on the street. There was another car, a familiar one, that had pulled up just a few yards away. Mrs. Thompson squinted through the haze and recognized the figure standing beside the car. It was Polly's former owner, the woman who had trained the bird to recognize danger. Mrs. Thompson's heart skipped a beat as she hurried toward the car. She could barely believe her eyes. The woman, who had been a frequent visitor to the Ramos household, was standing there, watching the fire with a solemn expression. As Mrs. Thompson approached, she noticed the woman's eyes were fixed on Polly, who had been perched on the front seat of the car. "You're here," Mrs. Thompson said, breathless. "How did you know?" The woman looked at her with a knowing gaze. "Polly always knew when something was wrong," she said quietly. "I taught her to respond to danger. She's been trained to recognize emergencies, to warn people when they're in danger." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, as if the weight of her words was heavy on her heart. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her mind racing. "So Polly was right?" she asked. She had to ask, even though she already knew the answer. The woman gave a faint smile. "Polly has never been wrong. She may not understand the full extent of it, but she knows when danger is near. She's been a lifesaver more times than I can count." Mrs. Thompson felt a surge of gratitude toward the bird. Polly had saved them all, even though no one had fully understood the bird's warnings until it was almost too late. Mrs. Thompson felt a new appreciation for Polly, a deep respect for the creature who had played such a crucial role in averting disaster. As the fire continued to burn, Mrs. Thompson found herself caught between two worlds, the world of routine, of safety, and the world of chaos, where danger could strike at any moment. But she had adapted. She had stepped up, done what needed to be done, and had found her place in the midst of the unknown. She had learned that sometimes the most important thing was not to wait for others to act, but to trust your instincts and take action yourself. With the fire under control and the Ramos family safe, Mrs. Thompson felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had survived the crisis, but more than that, she had discovered something profound about herself. In stepping outside her comfort zone, in adapting to the chaos around her, she had grown stronger, more resilient. The fear and doubt that had initially paralyzed her had given way to action. And in the process, she had learned that even in the most uncertain moments, there was always something that could be done. As the fire trucks continued to spray streams of water on the burning house, the atmosphere around the neighborhood slowly began to change. The air, once thick with smoke, was now clearing, and the harsh sound of the sirens faded into the background. The danger had been averted, at least for the moment, and the Ramos family, along with Mrs. Thompson, stood together on the sidewalk, gazing at the fire as it was being controlled. There was a sense of relief, but also an unspoken weight that hung between them, one that would take time to fully comprehend. Mrs. Ramos, clutching her husband's arm, slowly exhaled, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt the weight of the panic begin to lift from her chest. For the first time in what felt like hours, she felt a small sense of safety. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But even as the words left her lips, she realized how hollow they sounded. Yes, the fire had been contained and no one was hurt, but it wasn't truly over. Not for her, not for her family, and certainly not for Mrs. Thompson, who had stepped in when no one else could. For Mrs. Thompson, the relief was more complicated. As the fire department worked to put out the flames and secure the area, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of accomplishment. She had acted in the heat of the moment, had done what needed to be done, and had helped save lives. She had called for help, gotten Mrs. Ramos and her husband out of harm's way, and ensured that the firefighters had been alerted in time. In that brief moment of clarity, she had acted swiftly and decisively, and the result was undeniable. No one had been hurt, and the fire was under control. But as the adrenaline began to subside, Mrs. Thompson couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that lingered in her mind. Was this truly a victory? Was saving Mrs. Ramos and her husband enough to claim success? Or had she missed something? Had there been more she could have done? The questions were endless, and despite the victory that was unfolding before her eyes, she felt unsatisfied. There was a sense of emptiness that she couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Polly's former owner, who had arrived at the scene in the nick of time, stood beside Mrs. Thompson, quietly watching the firefighters work. Her gaze was fixed on the chaos that had unfolded only moments before. Polly, perched in the car, had remained silent for the duration of the emergency. But now, as the fire subsided and the danger passed, Polly let out a single, low squawk from her perch. The bird's voice was soft, almost contemplative. It was as though she, too, understood that the moment had passed, but that the battle for survival had been fought and won. Yet, Polly was still a reminder of what had been lost. The chaos, the confusion, the unknown. It had all been so sudden, so overwhelming. "You did it," Polly's former owner said to Mrs. Thompson, her voice steady but tinged with an undercurrent of grief. She didn't need to say more. She knew the weight that Mrs. Thompson carried now, the burden of having faced the impossible and yet still feeling as though she had somehow failed. Polly was right. She warned us. And you did exactly what needed to be done. Mrs. Thompson nodded, but there was a hesitation in her movement. She wanted to believe that what she had done was enough. She wanted to believe that saving the Ramos family and ensuring their safety was the ultimate victory. But as she looked at the smoldering house next door, the remnants of the fire still visible in the ashes, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that something more was at play. The victory she had experienced felt incomplete, as though it had come at a cost she couldn't yet fully understand. As the hours passed and the fire was finally reduced to smoldering embers, the neighborhood began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The firefighters packed up their equipment, their work done for the time being. The smoke that had once choked the air had dissipated, leaving behind only the faint scent of charred wood. Mrs. Ramos, now wrapped in a blanket that had been offered to her by a neighbor, sat on the curb, her face pale but grateful. Her husband, still in a daze, stood beside her, occasionally glancing over at Mrs. Thompson as though searching for some unspoken reassurance. "We'll be all right," Mrs. Ramos said, more to herself than to anyone else. But the words were not as certain as they once would have been. The events of the morning had left a mark on her, one she couldn't simply erase. The fire had been a rude awakening, a reminder of the fragility of life and how quickly things could change. Mrs. Thompson stood a little apart from the group, still processing everything that had happened. Her mind raced through the moments leading up to the fire, replaying each decision, each action, wondering if there was something she had missed. Had she done enough? Or had she simply been caught up in the chaos of the moment? It wasn't that she felt regret. It was more a sense of ambiguity, of not fully understanding the extent of what she had done. In a strange way, she realized that the danger wasn't truly over. Yes, the fire had been stopped, and yes, the Ramos family was safe. But what about Polly? What about the other neighbors? Had there been others in the area who might have been in danger? What if the fire had spread further? Or what if the warning hadn't come in time? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Mr. Ramos walking toward her, his face still pale but with a look of determination in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but strained. "We owe you everything. If it weren't for you and Polly, his voice faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You saved our lives." Mrs. Thompson nodded, feeling the weight of his gratitude settle in her chest. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? She had acted when no one else could. But even as she absorbed his words, there was still a nagging doubt at the back of her mind. She had been a part of saving the Ramos family, but was it enough? Was this the victory she had sought, or had it all been part of a much larger picture, one that she wasn't yet able to see? Polly, perched on her owner's shoulder, let out another soft squawk. The sound was almost soothing, as if the bird, too, was offering reassurance. It was a reminder that despite the uncertainty, despite the lingering questions, they had come through this together. Polly had warned them. Polly had been right. Yet, Mrs. Thompson couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that this wasn't the end. She had gotten what she wanted, a sense of resolution, a feeling of having done something important, but it was fleeting. The sense of victory was tainted by the realization that true resolution had not yet arrived. Something was missing, something that went beyond simply saving lives in the moment. What had she truly learned? What did she need to take away from all of this? As the sun began to set on the quiet neighborhood, the Ramos family gathered their things and prepared to head home. The danger had passed, and they would begin to rebuild their lives, But for Mrs. Thompson, the story wasn't over. She had been a part of something much bigger than herself, a moment of crisis, of survival, of instinct. But now she faced the harder question: what would she do with the knowledge she had gained? Had she truly learned what she needed to, or had she simply avoided a greater disaster? The false victory she felt now would soon be followed by a deeper understanding, one that would require her to confront the true nature of what had happened and what it all meant. The days following the fire were a blur for Mrs. Thompson. She had barely managed to gather herself, let alone process the full magnitude of what had happened. At first, it seemed as though everything would return to normal. The fire had been stopped, lives had been saved, and the neighborhood, though shaken, was now slowly recovering from the traumatic event. However, as time passed, a sense of unease began to settle into her life. The relief she had felt after the fire had been put out was slowly replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread, a fear that gnawed at her every waking moment. Mrs. Thompson tried to go back to her routine, the one she had known so well before the fire. But something had shifted in her. She couldn't shake the feeling that the victory she had experienced was hollow. The weight of responsibility, of having acted in a moment of crisis, had come crashing down on her. She had done what was needed, yes. But in the process, she had also uncovered a terrifying truth about herself. She had been capable of making split-second decisions that had life-or-death consequences. Decisions that had changed the course of events in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't that she regretted her actions. She knew, deep down, that she had done the right thing. She had called for help, had ensured the safety of the Ramos family, and had alerted the authorities in time to prevent further disaster. But the emotional toll of that split-second decision was beginning to sink in. Mrs. Thompson had learned something she hadn't fully grasped before. The weight of saving lives came with an unbearable price. A price that she hadn't been prepared to pay. At night, she would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. What if she had made the wrong decision? What if the fire had spread faster than anyone could have anticipated? What if the Ramos family hadn't been able to escape in time? What if the fire had consumed her own home? These questions had begun to haunt her thoughts, filling her with a deep sense of unease. And the more she tried to push them away, the more they seemed to consume her. Polly, who had been such a crucial part of the rescue effort, now felt like a distant memory. The bird, once so full of energy and purpose, had retreated into silence, as though it, too, was processing the gravity of what had happened. Mrs. Thompson had always considered Polly to be just a pet, an African gray parrot with a peculiar knack for mimicking human speech. But in the aftermath of the fire, Polly had become something far more significant. She had become a symbol of the fragile boundary between life and death, a reminder that the smallest actions could have monumental consequences. As the days stretched on, Mrs. Thompson found herself questioning everything she had known. Had she done enough? Had she made the right choices? The certainty that had once guided her decisions had been replaced by doubt, and the more she thought about the fire, the more she questioned her own ability to make life-altering decisions in the heat of the moment. Her relationship with her neighbors, too, had changed. Mrs. Ramos, though grateful, had begun to treat Mrs. Thompson with a sense of reverence that made her uncomfortable. The gratitude in her eyes was genuine, but there was also an unspoken expectation that Mrs. Thompson had somehow become a hero. And Mrs. Thompson wasn't sure she wanted to be anyone's hero. She wasn't sure she even deserved that title. The weight of the label pressed down on her, adding to the growing sense of guilt that she could not seem to shake. She had saved lives, yes, but at what cost? What had she sacrificed in the process? It wasn't just her peace of mind that had been taken from her. It was a sense of innocence, a belief that she could remain untouched by the brutality of life. In saving others, Mrs. Thompson had unwittingly opened a door to the reality that nothing was certain. No one was safe. No life was immune from the fragility of the world. The price of her actions was the loss of her own sense of security, the illusion that life could be lived without the constant knowledge that things could change in an instant. In the days following the fire, she found herself becoming withdrawn. The once vibrant and social woman who had enjoyed casual chats with neighbors now recoiled from social interaction. She was grateful for her friends' concern, but she no longer knew how to connect with them. The small talk and pleasantries that had once seemed so easy now felt empty, as though they were part of a world she no longer understood. She couldn't bring herself to talk about the fire, about Polly, about the decisions she had made. Every time she opened her mouth to speak, the weight of her actions seemed to suffocate her. Words failed her. It wasn't just the emotional toll that weighed heavily on her, it was also the physical strain. Mrs. Thompson hadn't been sleeping well since the fire. She would lie in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to find peace. She had developed a constant headache, a dull ache that never seemed to go away. Her appetite had diminished, and she found herself forgetting to eat or losing interest in food altogether. Her once healthy routine had unraveled, replaced by a constant state of unease. She couldn't focus on anything, not even the simplest tasks. She had always prided herself on being able to handle stress, to keep her emotions in check and maintain control over her life. But now, she felt as though everything was slipping through her fingers. The victory of saving the Ramos family seemed to be slipping away from her grasp, and in its place, a deeper sense of loss had taken root. She had thought that she was prepared for the aftermath of the fire, that the relief of saving lives would be enough to help her move on. But the truth was more complicated. She wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of a disaster, she was dealing with a shift in her very sense of self. And so, she continued to question herself, to ask whether the price of saving lives was worth the cost to her own mental and emotional well-being. Was she forever marked by this event? Would she ever be able to regain the sense of peace and security she had once known? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't go back. There was no going back to the woman she had been before the fire. She had changed. And while change was inevitable, it wasn't always something she could embrace. Her once unshakable belief in her own strength and resilience had been replaced by doubt. She was no longer certain that she could face the challenges ahead with the same confidence she once had. The truth was, the fire had cost her something far more valuable than she had initially realized. It had stolen her sense of invulnerability, her belief that she could remain untouched by the darker aspects of life. In saving others, she had exposed herself to the fragility of existence. And that, she realized, was a price she had not been prepared to pay. Mrs. Thompson had gotten what she wanted. She had saved lives, and the fire had been stopped. But in the process, she had lost something of herself. The victory, so bright in the moment, had begun to fade into something far more complex and painful. She had paid a heavy price for her actions, and the true cost of the victory was just beginning to reveal itself. She had saved others, yes, but now she had to confront the deeper emotional scars that came with that victory, the scars that could not be easily healed. As she stood in front of her house, looking out at the quiet neighborhood, Mrs. Thompson couldn't help but wonder, was this the life she had chosen? Or had it been thrust upon her? The answers were elusive, but one thing was certain, she was no longer the same person she had been before that morning. And whether that was for better or for worse, she didn't yet know. After weeks of grappling with the aftermath of the fire, Mrs. Thompson stood on the porch of her house one chilly autumn morning, her gaze lingering on the quiet street ahead. The events that had unfolded in her life over the past month felt like an otherworldly experience. She had saved lives, yes, but at what cost? Her thoughts, at times, were filled with the sharp pang of guilt, the relentless questioning of every decision she had made. The loss of innocence was painful, more painful than she had imagined. But now, as the days turned into weeks, she felt an unexpected clarity starting to emerge. The fire, Polly's warning, the frantic rescue, it was all behind her now. The disaster had been averted, and Mrs. Thompson had fulfilled her role as a responsible neighbor. Yet, her life had become tangled in the emotional aftermath of a decision made in the heat of the moment. It had all started to feel like a nightmare, the memories too heavy to carry without sinking beneath the weight. The cost of saving lives, as she had learned, was far greater than she could have ever anticipated. But something had begun to change. Perhaps it was the routine, the return to the familiar surroundings that began to offer her a sense of comfort. The world hadn't stopped. Her house stood in the same place. The trees along the road were just as they had been before the fire. It was almost as if nothing had happened. Except, of course, everything had changed. The house was still there, but she wasn't the same. However, with each passing day, she began to see that maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. There was something different in the air, an intangible shift, something that whispered of possibility and new beginnings. Mrs. Thompson had always prided herself on being a self-sufficient person. She didn't rely on anyone. She took care of herself. She had always believed that the universe worked in such a way that things would go on, that nothing was ever permanent, and that life would inevitably restore itself. But now, she was learning that it wasn't so much about returning to the past. It was about learning from the past and moving forward with the lessons it had taught her. It was about finding peace not in returning to what was, but in embracing what was to come. Her first step towards this new understanding came when she visited Mrs. Ramos at her house. The two women had become closer after the fire, drawn together by the shared experience of the rescue and the bond that had been formed in such a high-stakes situation. Mrs. Ramos had become more than just a neighbor. She was now a friend. Mrs. Thompson had, at first, felt the uncomfortable pressure of being regarded as a hero. But in the weeks following the fire, Mrs. Ramos' gratitude had turned into something more genuine. She was supportive, patient, and understanding. It was through these conversations with Mrs. Ramos that Mrs. Thompson began to see things more clearly. One afternoon, as they sat together in Mrs. Ramos' garden, sipping tea and talking about the changing seasons, Mrs. Thompson found herself opening up. She spoke about the emotional toll the fire had taken on her, about the sleepless nights, the constant questioning. Mrs. Ramos listened, her eyes compassionate, her silence comforting. And in that moment, Mrs. Thompson realized that she was not alone in her struggles. Everyone, she began to understand, carried some form of pain or doubt. Everyone had to grapple with the consequences of their actions. And the key to moving forward wasn't to bury those feelings, but to confront them, to allow herself the space to heal. "Don't you see, Linda?" Mrs. Ramos said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "You did what any of us would have done. You saved lives. That's something worth remembering. And yes, it has changed you, but you're still the same person. You just have a deeper understanding of the world now." It was in that moment that Mrs. Thompson realized that her guilt wasn't something she had to carry forever. Her actions had been guided by instinct, by a sense of duty and responsibility. The cost of saving others was not in the emotional scars she carried, but in the knowledge that life was fragile, that every moment counted. And with that knowledge came the opportunity for growth. The fire had changed her, but it had also given her the chance to embrace a new kind of strength, one that was born not of avoiding pain, but of accepting it, of living with it and using it to move forward. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson took Polly out of her cage. She hadn't paid much attention to the parrot since the fire. Polly, too, had retreated into herself, the lively chatter replaced with an eerie silence. But as Mrs. Thompson sat with her bird, she realized that Polly was part of the new chapter in her life. She wasn't just a pet, she was a companion. And in many ways, Polly had been the catalyst for this entire journey. The small creature who had sounded the alarm and, in doing so, had set into motion a chain of events that had led to Mrs. Thompson's own personal transformation. Polly's silence, now that Mrs. Thompson thought about it, was a reflection of her own silence, the silence that had taken over her life since the fire. Mrs. Thompson, in her desire to protect herself, had withdrawn from the world. She had avoided confronting her feelings, had buried her doubts deep within herself. But now, looking at Polly, she realized that she couldn't continue to live in that silence. It was time to move forward. "I'm sorry, Polly," Mrs. Thompson whispered to the bird, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been so caught up in my own head, but I'm ready to move on now. We both are." And in that moment, as though understanding the change in Mrs. Thompson, Polly let out a small squawk, an almost imperceptible sound that felt like a fresh start. Mrs. Thompson smiled softly, feeling a weight lifting off her chest. The healing process was slow, but it was steady. Mrs. Thompson returned to her daily routine, not with the same sense of certainty she had before, but with a new awareness. She had learned that there was no such thing as an invulnerable life. Everyone faced challenges, and sometimes those challenges were life-altering. But it was in how we responded to those challenges that our true strength lay. It was in the willingness to face the uncomfortable truths, to confront our vulnerabilities, and to move forward despite the fear. That was where true resilience was born. Mrs. Thompson no longer viewed the world through the same lens. She no longer expected life to be predictable, to follow a neat and orderly path. Instead, she embraced the uncertainty of it all, the unpredictability, the impermanence. And with that acceptance came a kind of peace, a peace she hadn't known before. She continued to spend time with the Ramos family, visiting them regularly and sharing stories. They were no longer just neighbors, they were family, bound together by the shared experience of the fire and the mutual understanding that came with it. Mrs. Thompson had learned that she could still be strong, even in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of fear. And that strength was something she would carry with her, no matter what came next. As she stood in front of her house, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mrs. Thompson finally understood the truth. The price of saving lives wasn't in the emotional scars or the guilt. It was in the transformation that came afterward, the transformation that allowed her to see the world with new eyes, to appreciate the fragility of life, and to embrace the moments of joy and connection that came with it. She wasn't the same person she had been before the fire, and she would never be. But in that moment, as she stood on her porch, she realized that wasn't a bad thing. It was the beginning of something new. The beginning of a life lived with purpose, with understanding, and with the quiet strength that came from having faced the worst and come out the other side. Polly chirped again, and Mrs. Thompson smiled. It wasn't just the bird that had changed. It was her too, and that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.